I never imagined that a simple shopping trip for my daughter's birthday dress would become the moment my entire world collapsed. Standing in Premier Boutique at Westfield Shopping Center, holding a declined credit card while my husband, David, walked away with his business associate, Jessica, I felt something inside me shatter and then immediately begin to rebuild into something far more dangerous than he could have ever anticipated. The humiliation of that moment, surrounded by strangers, and faced with the reality that my husband had deliberately maxed out our cards before abandoning me, would have destroyed the old Sarah Mitchell. But that woman died in the fluorescent lighting of that upscale store. In her place stood someone who would not only survive this betrayal, but would transform it into the foundation of an empire that would make David's financial advisory business look like a lemonade stand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and until 6 months ago, I thought I had the perfect life. Married for 12 years to David, a successful financial advisor in Riverside, California, mother to our 8-year-old daughter Sophie, and living in a beautiful home in the exclusive Oceanview Estates neighborhood. I had spent the last decade building what I believed was a solid foundation for our family's future, supporting David's career while managing our household and volunteering extensively in our community. David had always been the breadwinner, earning substantial commissions from his investment firm, Mitchell & Bradley Financial, while I focused on creating the perfect home environment and maintaining our social connections. I had my own marketing background from before Sophie was born, but David had convinced me that my talents were better utilized supporting his career growth and ensuring our family's stability. Looking back now, I can see how methodically he had isolated me from my own professional identity, making me financially dependent while positioning himself as the sole decision-maker in our marriage. The morning of what I now call Liberation Day started like any other Saturday. David announced over breakfast that he needed to meet with an important client at the mall, something about finalizing a major investment portfolio while the client was in town for just one day. Jessica Chen, his business associate from the Los Angeles office, would be joining them to provide additional expertise on international markets. The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. at the Starbucks near Premier Boutique, and David suggested I take Sophie shopping for her birthday dress while they conducted their business. It seemed like perfect timing. Sophie's 9th birthday party was the following weekend, and she had been begging for a specific style of dress she had seen in the Premier Boutique window during our last visit to Westfield. The store was known for its high-end children's clothing, and while expensive, David had always encouraged me to buy the best for Sophie. He handed me his platinum credit card that morning with a kiss on the forehead and a comment about how lucky Sophie was to have such a devoted mother. Sophie was practically vibrating with excitement as we walked through the mall toward Premier Boutique. She had been talking about this dress for weeks, describing it in detail to anyone who would listen. The dress was a beautiful midnight blue velvet creation with delicate silver embroidery, sophisticated enough for a 9-year-old but age-appropriate. At $350, it was certainly an investment, but David had always insisted that quality was worth the price. The boutique itself was everything Sophie had imagined and more. Soft classical music played in the background, while elegantly dressed sales associates moved quietly among the displays of carefully curated clothing. Carol Thompson, the store manager, greeted us warmly, remembering Sophie from our previous visits and immediately understanding what we were looking for. Within minutes, Sophie was in the dressing room trying on her dream dress, and I was mentally calculating the additional accessories and shoes that would complete the perfect birthday outfit. When Sophie emerged from the dressing room, spinning, in the mirror with pure joy on her face, I knew we had found exactly what we were looking for. The dress fit perfectly, and her smile was worth any price. Carol began gathering matching accessories while I mentally reviewed our budget for the month. David had been earning excellent commissions lately, and Sophie's happiness was always our top priority. The total came to $627, including the dress, matching shoes, and a delicate silver necklace that Sophie had fallen in love with. I handed over David's platinum card without hesitation, already imagining Sophie's face when she wore the complete outfit to her party. Carol swiped the card with a professional smile, but after a moment, her expression shifted to one of confusion. The card was declined. Carol tried the transaction again, thinking it might be a processing error, but the result was the same. She apologetically suggested that perhaps there was a temporary hold on the account, or a security flag due to the weekend timing. I felt a flush of embarrassment but pulled out our secondary credit card, the one we kept for emergencies and backup situations. That card was also declined. The third card, our department store credit line that we rarely used, met the same fate. Sophie, still wearing the dress she loved so much, looked between Carol and me with growing confusion. Other customers in the boutique were beginning to glance our way, and I felt the familiar heat of public embarrassment creeping up my neck. I excused myself to call David, stepping outside the store while Carol kindly entertained Sophie by showing her other items in the boutique. David's phone went directly to voicemail, which was unusual during business hours. I tried again with the same result. My call to the credit card company revealed the shocking truth that all our accounts had been maxed out in the past 48 hours, with large cash advances and transfers that I knew nothing about. Returning to the boutique, I had to face the humiliating task of explaining to Carol that there seemed to be an issue with our accounts and that we would need to return the items. Sophie's face fell as she realized she wouldn't be getting her dream dress, and I promised her we would sort everything out and return soon. Carol was gracious and understanding, but I could see the judgment in the eyes of other customers who had witnessed the entire scene. As we left Premier Boutique, Sophie clinging to my hand with tears in her eyes, I spotted David across the mall food court. He was sitting at a table with Jessica Chen, but this wasn't the business meeting he had described. They were holding hands across the table, laughing intimately, and Jessica was wearing a stunning new outfit with shopping bags from several high-end stores surrounding their table. The same stores where I had just been declined for purchases. The realization hit me like a physical blow. David hadn't been conducting business. He had been on a shopping spree with Jessica, using our credit lines to buy her gifts while deliberately ensuring that I would be humiliated when I tried to make purchases for our daughter. The timing wasn't coincidental. He had planned this entire scenario, knowing exactly when and where I would be shopping, arranging for maximum embarrassment in a public setting. I watched from a distance as David fed Jessica a bite of expensive dessert, completely absorbed in their intimate conversation. Neither of them noticed Sophie and me standing 50 feet away, witnessing the destruction of our family in real time. Jessica was wearing jewelry I recognized from the boutique windows we had passed, items that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Our family's financial resources were being lavished on David's affair partner, while our own daughter was denied a birthday dress. Sophie tugged on my sleeve, asking why Daddy was with the lady from his work and why they looked like they were on a date. The innocence in her question nearly broke my heart. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that her father has chosen to prioritize another woman over his own family's basic needs and dignity? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I made the decision in that moment not to confront David publicly. Sophie had already experienced enough trauma for one day, and I refused to subject her to the additional chaos of a public confrontation between her parents. Instead, I took her hand and led her toward the mall exit, my mind already beginning to formulate a plan that would go far beyond simply addressing David's betrayal. As we walked past the store windows displaying all the items I couldn't afford to buy for my daughter, I felt something crystallize inside me. The woman who had entered this mall as a trusting wife and devoted mother was gone. In her place was someone who understood that David had made a fatal miscalculation. He had assumed that public humiliation would break me, that financial manipulation, would render me powerless, that I would quietly accept this betrayal and perhaps even compete with Jessica for his attention. He was wrong about everything. The drive home was conducted in relative silence, with Sophie eventually falling asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the emotional roller coaster of the afternoon. I used the time to mentally catalog everything. I knew about our financial situation, David's business practices, and the network of relationships I had spent 12 years cultivating as his supportive wife. He had underestimated the very skills he had encouraged me to develop in service of his career. My background in marketing, which David had dismissed as unnecessary once I became a full-time mother, suddenly seemed more relevant than ever. I understood brand building, market analysis, and strategic communication. More importantly, I understood the social and professional networks that David relied upon for his business success. Networks I had helped him build and maintain through years of entertaining clients, organizing social events, and building relationships with influential families in our community. David didn't return home that evening. His absence confirmed what I had suspected watching him with Jessica at the mall. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a midlife crisis that could be resolved through counseling. This was a calculated decision to replace his current life with a new one, using our family's resources to finance the transition while ensuring I was left in the most vulnerable position possible. That night, after Sophie was safely asleep, I sat in our home office surrounded by 12 years of financial documents, business records, and social correspondence. David had always handled our major financial decisions, but I had been far from uninvolved. I had organized his client entertainment events, maintained relationships with their spouses, and kept detailed records of business expenses and social obligations for tax purposes. As I reviewed our financial statements with new eyes, patterns emerged that I had previously attributed to David's business acumen. Irregular transfers between accounts, consulting fees paid to companies I didn't recognize, and business expenses that seemed unusually high for client entertainment. David hadn't just betrayed our marriage. He had been systematically moving our assets in preparation for this moment, ensuring that when he finally revealed his affair, I would be left with minimal resources to fight back. But David had made one crucial error in his calculations. He had assumed that I would react emotionally, that the shock and humiliation would render me incapable of strategic thinking. He had forgotten that behind the role of supportive wife and devoted mother was the woman who had built successful marketing campaigns, who understood how to identify vulnerabilities and leverage relationships for maximum impact. The woman he had spent 12 years training to support his ambitions was about to become his most formidable opponent. As dawn broke over Riverside, I closed the last financial folder and opened my laptop. The first phase of my strategy would require careful research and methodical planning. David thought he had checkmated me by controlling our finances and public narrative. He was about to discover that the game was far from over and that his opponent was playing by rules he had never bothered to learn. The mall where I had been humiliated the day before would become the centerpiece of my counterattack. Premiere. Boutique, where I had been forced to return my daughter's birthday dress due to declined credit cards, would eventually become the symbol of my transformation from victim to victor. But that victory would require patience, strategy, and a complete reinvention of everything David thought he knew about his quiet, accommodating wife. The old Sarah Mitchell had died in that boutique yesterday. The woman who would take her place would be far more dangerous than David could possibly imagine. The next morning arrived with an eerie silence that felt like the calm before a hurricane. David still hadn't returned home, and his absence spoke louder than any explanation he could have offered. I woke Sophie with extra gentleness, knowing that her world was about to change dramatically, even if she didn't yet understand the extent of it. Over breakfast, I maintained the facade of normalcy, while my mind raced through the implications of everything I had discovered during my late-night financial review. Sophie asked innocently when Daddy would be home, and I told her he was working on a very important project that might keep him away for a while. The truth was far more complicated, but 8-year-olds shouldn't have to bear the weight of adult betrayals. As I packed her lunch and prepared her for school, I made a silent promise that whatever David had planned for our family's future, Sophie would emerge from this chaos stronger and more secure than ever before. After dropping Sophie at Golden Hills Elementary, I drove directly to Marina Coffee House, a quiet establishment downtown where I could think without the emotional weight of our home surrounding me. The barista, a young woman named Kelly who had served me during previous visits, noticed my subdued demeanor and offered a concerned smile along with my usual order. Her kindness nearly brought tears to my eyes, reminding me that not everyone in the world was capable of the calculated cruelty David had demonstrated. Settling into a corner booth with my laptop and a large coffee, I began the systematic process of understanding exactly what David had done to our finances and what options remained available to me. The picture that emerged was both worse and better than I had initially feared. Worse because the scope of his financial manipulation extended back months, suggesting this betrayal had been carefully planned rather than impulsive. Better because his methodical approach had left a detailed paper trail that would serve my purposes perfectly. David had been moving money through a series of transfers that were designed to look like legitimate business expenses and investment reallocations. Consulting fees paid to LLCs that didn't seem to exist, travel expenses for trips I had never heard him mention, and entertainment costs that far exceeded what I remembered from our actual social activities. Most tellingly, he had opened several credit lines in both our names without my knowledge, using our excellent credit history to secure substantial borrowing capacity that he had then systematically maxed out. The realization hit me that David's timeline for revealing his affair had been determined not by passion or impulse, but by the completion of his financial preparations. He had calculated exactly how long it would take to position himself advantageously, while leaving me with maximum debt and minimum liquid assets. The mall incident hadn't been a coincidence or a moment of cruel inspiration. It had been the culmination of a months-long campaign designed to ensure my complete financial and social helplessness. But David had made several critical errors in his calculations, mistakes that stemmed from his fundamental misunderstanding of who I was beneath the role I had played in our marriage. He had assumed that 12 years of apparent domesticity had erased my professional capabilities and strategic thinking. He had forgotten that I held a degree in marketing and communications, that I had successfully managed complex campaigns before Sophie was born, and that I had spent our entire marriage building and maintaining the social and professional networks that had been crucial to his success. Most importantly, he had underestimated the strength that comes from having nothing left to lose. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief and devastating in its casual cruelty. "Sarah, this is Jessica. I think it's time we talked. David has explained the situation, and I believe we can work something out that's best for everyone, especially Sophie. Meet me at the Riverside Plaza Hotel lobby at 2 p.m. today." The audacity of Jessica contacting me directly, using my daughter's welfare as leverage, ignited something cold and focused inside me. She was attempting to position herself as the reasonable party in this situation, the mature adult who could help navigate the transition from David's old life to his new one. The subtext was clear. She expected me to gracefully step aside, perhaps in exchange for some face-saving financial arrangement that would allow David to maintain his reputation while abandoning his family. Instead of responding to Jessica's text, I drove to the offices of Michael Foster, an attorney whose name I remembered from various community functions. Michael specialized in family law and had a reputation for aggressive advocacy on behalf of his clients. His secretary managed to fit me in for a consultation that afternoon, and I spent the remaining morning hours preparing for what would be the first strategic move in my counterattack. The consultation with Michael Foster proved illuminating in ways I hadn't expected. He reviewed the financial documents I had brought with clinical detachment, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions. When I finished explaining the situation, including David's systematic asset manipulation and the planned meeting with Jessica, Michael leaned back in his chair with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said carefully, "your husband has been very thorough in his preparations, but he's also been remarkably sloppy in execution. These transfers and credit applications required your signature, or at least your social security number. If you didn't authorize them, we're looking at potential fraud, not just marital misconduct." The implications of Michael's observation sent a chill down my spine. David hadn't just betrayed our marriage and planned my humiliation. He had committed actual crimes, using my identity and credit history without authorization to finance his new life with Jessica. The financial manipulation I had attributed to careful planning was actually evidence of criminal behavior that could result in serious legal consequences. Michael continued his analysis with increasing enthusiasm. Moreover, the timing of these transactions in relation to his affair creates a pattern that will be very difficult for him to explain in divorce proceedings. California is a no-fault state, but financial misconduct and fraud are different matters entirely. We can pursue criminal charges while simultaneously filing for divorce with a petition for emergency financial relief. As I absorbed this information, a strategy began forming that went far beyond simply protecting myself and Sophie from David's betrayal. If he had committed fraud, then he had given me weapons I could use not just defensively, but offensively. The man who had thought he was so cleverly positioning himself for a new life had actually created the means for his own destruction. Michael's next question caught me off guard. "Mrs. Mitchell, what do you want to achieve here? Are you looking for a quick settlement that gets you out of this situation with minimal conflict? Or are you prepared for a more comprehensive approach that holds your husband fully accountable for his actions?" I thought about Sophie's disappointed face in the boutique yesterday, about the years I had spent supporting David's career while suppressing my own ambitions, about Jessica's presumptuous text message assuming I would quietly disappear from my own life. When I answered, my voice was steady and completely certain. I want David to face the full consequences of every choice he's made, and I want to rebuild my life in a way that ensures Sophie and I never depend on anyone else's financial decisions again. Michael smiled for the first time during our meeting. "Then I think we're going to work very well together." I left Michael's office with a clear understanding of my legal options and a timeline for implementing them. The meeting with Jessica would proceed as scheduled, but not for the reasons she anticipated. Instead of a negotiation about my graceful exit from David's life, it would be an opportunity to gather intelligence about their plans and intentions while giving nothing away about my own developing strategy. The Riverside Plaza hotel lobby was exactly the kind of neutral public space that Jessica would have chosen for maximum psychological advantage. Elegant without being ostentatious, busy enough to prevent any emotional outbursts, and sufficiently upscale to remind me of the lifestyle I was supposedly about to lose. I arrived precisely on time, wearing one of my most conservative outfits to project the image of a traditional wife in crisis rather than a strategic opponent preparing for battle. Jessica was waiting at a corner table, dressed impeccably in what I recognized as one of the outfits David had purchased for her during their shopping spree. She had chosen her appearance carefully, projecting success and confidence while maintaining an air of sympathetic concern. When she stood to greet me, her expression was perfectly calibrated to convey regretful necessity rather than triumphant victory. "Sarah, thank you for coming," she said, extending her hand as though we were business associates meeting to discuss a routine matter. "I know this situation is difficult for everyone involved, but I think we can find a path forward that minimizes the disruption for Sophie." I accepted her handshake and settled into the chair across from her, maintaining a calm demeanor while mentally recording every detail of her appearance and behavior. Jessica had clearly prepared for this conversation, and I suspected David had coached her on how to handle my expected emotional reactions. They had planned this meeting as carefully as they had planned their financial manipulations, anticipating that I would be too devastated and desperate to think strategically. "I appreciate your concern for Sophie," I replied evenly. She's obviously my primary priority in all of this." Jessica's smile became slightly more genuine, as though she had been worried about my potential volatility and was relieved to find me reasonable. "David has explained how much you've sacrificed for your family over the years. He feels terrible about how things have worked out, but sometimes life takes unexpected turns. The important thing now is to handle the transition as smoothly as possible." The casual way she referred to David's betrayal as how things have worked out and unexpected turns revealed everything I needed to know about how they had framed this situation in their own minds. They had convinced themselves that their affair was somehow inevitable, that David's abandonment of his family was a natural consequence of discovering true love rather than a deliberate choice to prioritize their desires over existing obligations. "What kind of transition are you envisioning?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral and curious rather than confrontational. Jessica leaned forward slightly, warming to what she clearly saw as a productive negotiation. "David's business has been very successful lately, and he wants to make sure you and Sophie are taken care of. He's prepared to be very generous with spousal support and child support, well above what any court would require. In exchange, he's hoping for an amicable divorce that doesn't create unnecessary complications for his professional reputation." The offer was exactly what I had expected: financial support in exchange for my silence and cooperation in maintaining David's public image. Jessica was presenting it as generosity, but I understood it as the price David was willing to pay to avoid the consequences of his fraudulent financial behavior and professional misconduct. He wanted to buy my complicity in his narrative that this was simply a marriage that hadn't worked out, rather than a systematic betrayal involving criminal activity. "That sounds very thoughtful," I said carefully. "What kind of timeline were you thinking for this transition?" Jessica's relief was visible as she interpreted my response as acceptance of their proposal. "David thought perhaps 6 months for you to adjust and make new living arrangements. Enough time to find a place that works for Sophie's school schedule, and for you to get back on your feet professionally. He's even mentioned that his firm might have some marketing consulting opportunities that could help you rebuild your career." The condescension in her offer was breathtaking. David was prepared to throw me a few consulting projects as though I were a charity case rather than the woman who had spent 12 years building the social and professional networks that had made his success possible. He apparently believed that I would be grateful for the opportunity to work for the company where he had conducted his affair, accepting a subordinate professional relationship with the man who had systematically stolen from me. "And what about the house?" I asked, continuing to project cooperative interest. "David feels it would be best for Sophie to stay in familiar surroundings, so he'd like to keep the family home. But he's prepared to give you a substantial cash settlement that would allow you to purchase something very nice in a good neighborhood. Maybe something smaller but more manageable for just you and Sophie." There it was. David wanted to keep our home, the house we had purchased together and renovated over years of marriage, to serve as his love nest with Jessica. Meanwhile, I would be relocated to some smaller property, physically displaced from the life I had built while he maintained all the symbols and structures of his success. Sophie would visit her diminished mother in her reduced circumstances while living primarily in her original home with David and his replacement wife. The casual cruelty of this arrangement, presented as though it were generous and considerate, crystallized my resolve completely. David and Jessica had planned every aspect of my destruction with the same careful attention they had brought to their financial manipulations. They expected me to accept not just the loss of my marriage, but my willing participation in my own erasure from the life I had spent 12 years building. "This all sounds very reasonable," I said, maintaining my facade of grateful cooperation. "I'll need some time to think it over and perhaps discuss it with an attorney, just to make sure I understand all the implications." Jessica's expression shifted slightly, the first hint of concern breaking through her confident presentation. "Of course, that's completely understandable. David just hopes that we can keep this as simple and private as possible. Lawyers sometimes complicate situations that could be resolved more easily between reasonable people. The suggestion that involving legal representation would be unreasonable was exactly the confirmation I needed that their offer was designed to exploit my supposed vulnerability rather than provide actual protection for Sophie and me. They wanted my agreement before I had time to fully understand what I would be giving up or what alternatives might be available. I completely understand David's preference for privacy, I assured her. His professional reputation is important, and I certainly don't want to create any unnecessary difficulties for his business. Jessica's smile returned, broader and more satisfied than before. She clearly believed she had successfully managed this potentially volatile situation, convincing the abandoned wife to accept her fate gracefully in exchange for financial consideration. As she gathered her purse and prepared to leave, she reached across the table to touch my hand with what she probably imagined was sisterly compassion. "Sarah, I want you to know that I really respect how you're handling this. David was worried about how you might react, but you're being incredibly mature about everything. Sophie is lucky to have such a strong mother. The irony of receiving praise for my strength from the woman who had conspired to destroy my family was almost overwhelming, but I managed to maintain my composed expression. Thank you, Jessica. That means a lot to me." After she left, I remained in the hotel lobby for several more minutes, processing everything I had learned during our conversation. David and Jessica had revealed their complete strategy, their timeline, and most importantly, their assumptions about my capabilities and likely responses. They believed they had neutralized me as a threat by combining financial pressure with an offer that appeared generous while actually ensuring my continued dependence and diminished status. They had also confirmed that David's primary concern was protecting his professional reputation, which meant he feared the consequences of his actions becoming public knowledge. His business success depended on trust and credibility, and any revelation of his fraudulent financial behavior or systematic betrayal of his family would devastate his ability to maintain client relationships and professional partnerships. As I drove home from the hotel, I felt the last vestiges of the old Sarah Mitchell disappearing completely. The woman who had spent 12 years prioritizing David's comfort and success above her own ambitions was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood that she had been systematically underestimated and was prepared to use that miscalculation to devastating effect. That evening, after Sophie was safely asleep, I sat down with my laptop and began researching premier boutiques, ownership structure, and financial status. If David wanted to play games with shopping and public humiliation, I would show him what a truly strategic approach to retail warfare looked like. By the time I finished my research, I had the foundation of a plan that would transform his moment of calculated cruelty into the cornerstone of my own empire. The boutique where I had been humiliated would become the symbol of my resurrection. But first, I needed to complete the systematic destruction of everything David thought he had secured for himself and Jessica. They had planned my downfall with meticulous care, but they had forgotten the most important rule of strategic warfare. Never underestimate your opponent's capacity for learning from their mistakes. The transformation began at 5:30 the next morning when I stood in our walk-in closet, systematically removing every piece of clothing that David had ever commented on or influenced me to purchase. Soft pastels that he claimed made me look feminine, conservative cuts that he said were appropriate for a mother, subdued colors that wouldn't draw attention away from him at business functions. Each item went into donation bags with the methodical precision of someone discarding an old identity. What remained was a wardrobe I barely recognized as my own. Bold colors I had forgotten I owned, tailored pieces that emphasized my figure rather than concealing it, statement jewelry that had been relegated to the back of my jewelry box because David found it too flashy. As I dressed for what would be my first day of strategic warfare, I chose a crimson blazer that made my skin glow and my eyes look fierce. The woman in the mirror was someone David had never met, someone he had systematically suppressed without even realizing she existed. My first stop was the bank, where I intended to begin unraveling the financial web David had woven. Armed with the documentation Michael Foster had helped me organize, I requested a meeting with the branch manager, Patricia Hernandez, who had handled our accounts for years. Patricia's expression grew increasingly grave as I explained the unauthorized transactions and credit applications, her professional concerns shifting to barely contained outrage as the scope of David's deception became clear. "Mrs. Mitchell, what your husband has done constitutes serious fraud," Patricia said, reviewing the timeline of transactions I had prepared. "These credit applications clearly show forged signatures, and the cash advances were conducted using your social security number without your authorization. We need to report this to our fraud department immediately." The bank's response was swift and comprehensive. Within hours, fraud alerts were placed on all accounts. Unauthorized transactions were flagged for investigation, and new credit lines were frozen pending a full review. More importantly, Patricia provided me with detailed records of every transaction, including ATM camera footage that showed Jessica using cards issued in my name. The evidence was damning and would serve multiple purposes in my developing strategy. My next destination was Mitchell and Bradley Financial, where I intended to have a conversation with Tom Bradley, David's business partner. Tom had always been the more conservative half of their partnership, focused on ethical practices and long-term client relationships, while David pursued aggressive growth strategies. If anyone would be concerned about David's recent behavior and its potential impact on the firm's reputation, it would be Tom. The offices of Mitchell and Bradley occupied an elegant suite in downtown Riverside's premier business district. I had been there countless times for holiday parties and client events, but never as anything other than David's supportive wife. Walking through the reception area in my crimson blazer, projecting confidence rather than submission, I felt like I was seeing the space clearly for the first time. The understated luxury, the carefully curated art, the atmosphere of quiet success, all of it had been built on the foundation of client trust that David was now systematically destroying. Tom's secretary, Margaret, greeted me with surprised warmth. "Sarah, how wonderful to see you. David didn't mention you were coming in today." "He doesn't know I'm here," I replied with a smile that carried just enough mystery to spark curiosity. "I was hoping to speak with Tom about a business matter. Is he available for a few minutes?" Margaret's expression shifted slightly, her professional instincts sensing undercurrents she couldn't quite identify. "Let me check his schedule. Can I tell him what this is regarding?" "Marketing opportunities for the firm," I said, which was technically true, even if not in the way she would interpret it. "I've been developing some ideas that I think he might find interesting." Tom Bradley emerged from his office within minutes, his genuine pleasure at seeing me mixed with obvious curiosity about my unexpected visit. Tom was a few years older than David, distinguished in the way that comes from decades of success and integrity. He had always treated me with more respect than David's other business associates, seeming to recognize capabilities in me that others overlooked. "Sarah, this is a delightful surprise," he said, gesturing toward his office. "Please, come in." Margaret mentioned something about marketing ideas. Tom's office reflected his personality perfectly. Where David's workspace was all sharp angles and aggressive modernity, Tom's was warm and inviting, filled with family photos and mementos from decades of client relationships. As I settled into the chair across from his desk, I noticed a new tension in his demeanor that suggested all was not well in the partnership. "Tom, I'll be direct," I began, meeting his eyes steadily. "I'm here because I'm concerned about David's recent behavior and its potential impact on the firm's reputation. I think you might share those concerns." Tom's expression became carefully neutral, but I caught the flash of relief in his eyes. He had been worried about David's conduct and was grateful to have someone to discuss it with, even if that someone was David's wife. "What specific behaviors are you referring to, Sarah?" His relationship with Jessica Chen, for starters, I said, watching Tom's reaction carefully. The extensive out-of-town trips, the unusual expense patterns, the decision-making that seems increasingly focused on short-term gains rather than long-term client relationships. Tom leaned back in his chair, his relief now obvious. Sarah, I've been concerned about David's judgment lately, but I wasn't sure how to address it. The Jessica situation is particularly troubling from a professional standpoint. She's been involved in client meetings where she has no legitimate business presence, and some of our clients have expressed discomfort with the dynamic. This was exactly the opening I had hoped for. Tom's concerns about David's professional conduct would provide the perfect foundation for the next phase of my strategy. Tom, what would happen to the firm if David's personal conduct became a public scandal? How would that affect your other clients and business relationships? Tom's expression grew somber. It would be devastating, frankly. Our business is built on trust and discretion. If David's affair became widely known, especially with the circumstances involved, it could seriously damage our reputation with conservative clients who expect their financial advisors to demonstrate personal integrity. And if David's conduct involved actual fraud or financial misconduct? I asked, keeping my tone curious rather than accusatory. Tom's face went pale. Sarah, what are you saying? Has David done something illegal? I opened my briefcase and handed Tom a folder containing copies of the bank documentation I had gathered that morning. His expression grew increasingly grave as he reviewed the evidence of unauthorized credit applications and fraudulent transactions. When he looked up, his face was a mixture of anger and concern. This is serious, Sarah. If David has been using your identity for unauthorized financial transactions, it's not just a marital issue. It's criminal fraud that could expose the firm to regulatory scrutiny and civil liability. That's exactly what I was afraid of, I replied. Tom, I respect you and value our friendship, but I want you to know that I'm going to pursue this matter fully. David's actions have left me no choice but to protect myself and Sophie through whatever legal means are necessary. Tom nodded slowly, understanding the implications immediately. Sarah, I appreciate you coming to me directly. This gives me the opportunity to begin distancing the firm from David's actions before they become public. Can you give me a timeline for when this might become a legal matter? My attorney is filing criminal complaints this week, I said, which was true even if the timeline was somewhat accelerated for dramatic effect. I wanted to give you advance warning because I know this will affect more than just David. Tom stood and walked to his window, staring out at the city skyline as he processed the implications of David's downfall. Sarah, I want you to know that whatever happens between you and David, I consider you a friend of this firm. If there's anything I can do to help you through this transition, please don't hesitate to ask. Actually, there is something, I said, seizing the opening he had provided. I'm going to be rebuilding my career, and I'd appreciate any connections you might have in the marketing and business development field. I have skills that have been underutilized for years, and I'm ready to apply them in a professional context again. Tom turned back to me with genuine enthusiasm. Sarah, I've always thought you were wasted as just a corporate wife. Your organizational skills and social intelligence are remarkable. I'd be happy to make some introductions. As I left Tom's office with a list of potential professional contacts and the satisfaction of having planted the seeds of David's professional destruction, I felt the intoxicating rush of strategic success. Tom would begin distancing the firm from David immediately, protecting his own interests while accelerating David's isolation from the business relationships that defined his identity. My next stop was Westfield Shopping Center, but this time, I wasn't there as a humiliated customer. I was there as a potential investor conducting due diligence. The mall directory provided the information I needed about Premier Boutique's location and neighboring stores, and a conversation with the information desk clerk revealed that the boutique had been struggling financially since the pandemic, with Rumors of potential closure or sale circulating among mall employees. I spent an hour walking through the shopping center, observing foot traffic patterns, noting which stores seemed busy and which appeared to be struggling. Premier Boutique occupied prime real estate near the main entrance, with excellent visibility and access. The space itself was beautifully appointed, but I noticed subtle signs of financial strain. Reduced inventory, minimal staff, sale signs that suggested desperation rather than seasonal promotion. Carol Thompson, the store manager who had witnessed my humiliation just days earlier, greeted me with surprise and what appeared to be genuine concern. "Mrs. Mitchell, how are you? I was so sorry about the confusion with your cards the other day." "Actually, that's part of why I'm here," I said, projecting the calm confidence of someone who had moved far beyond that embarrassing incident. "I wanted to thank you for your professionalism during what turned out to be a very difficult situation in my personal life." Carol's expression softened with understanding. I could sense there was more going on than just a credit card issue. "I hope everything is working out for you." "It's actually working out better than I could have imagined," I replied with a smile that was completely genuine. "In fact, I'm exploring some business opportunities in retail, and I was wondering if you might have a few minutes to talk about the industry from a management perspective." Carol's eyes lit up with interest. Retail managers rarely had the opportunity to discuss their expertise with potential investors, and she was clearly eager to share her knowledge. Over coffee in the mall's food court, she painted a detailed picture of Premier Boutique's challenges and opportunities. "The location is fantastic, and the customer base is definitely there," Carol explained. "But the current owners are based in New York and don't really understand the local market. They've been cutting costs in ways that damage the shopping experience, and they're not investing in the kind of inventory and marketing that would drive sales growth." "What would it take to turn the business around?" I asked, taking notes. "With the dedication of someone seriously considering an investment." Carol's enthusiasm grew as she outlined her vision for the store's potential. Better inventory management, expanded size ranges, improved customer service, strategic marketing to attract younger demographics while maintaining the upscale positioning. It was clear she had been thinking about these improvements for months, but lacked the authority or resources to implement them. "If you don't mind me asking," Carol said carefully, "what's your background in retail?" "Marketing and business development," I replied. "I've been focused on family for the past several years, but I'm ready to get back into the business world in a more active way. Retail appeals to me because it combines strategic planning with direct customer interaction." Carol nodded thoughtfully. "You'd probably want to talk to the owners directly if you're serious about investing. I know they've been open to partnership discussions, especially with someone who has local connections and marketing expertise." As I gathered my things to leave, Carol handed me a business card with contact information for the boutique's ownership group. "Mrs. Mitchell, I hope you'll seriously consider this. Premier Boutique has so much potential, and it would be wonderful to work with someone who really understands the vision." Driving home, I reflected on how dramatically my situation had changed in just 48 hours. The woman who had been humiliated and financially manipulated in that very store was now positioned to potentially own it. David's cruel calculation had backfired spectacularly, transforming his moment of triumph into the catalyst for my own empowerment. That evening, I found Sophie in her room, working on homework with unusual intensity. When I asked how school had been, she looked up with eyes that seemed older than her 8 years. "Mom, some kids at school were talking about divorces," she said carefully. "They said when parents get divorced, sometimes kids have to choose who to live with. Is that going to happen to us?" The directness of her question caught me off guard, but I recognized that Sophie's intelligence and emotional maturity meant she deserved honest answers appropriate to her age. "Sophie, your dad and I are having some serious problems that we're trying to work out. Whatever happens, you need to know that both of us love you very much, and any decisions we make will be focused on what's best for you. Are you getting divorced because of that lady Dad was with at the mall? She asked, confirming that she had understood far more about Saturday's events than I had realized. I sat down beside her on the bed, choosing my words carefully. Sometimes adults make choices that hurt the people they're supposed to protect. When that happens, other adults have to make difficult decisions to keep their families safe and healthy. Sophie nodded with a seriousness that broke my heart. Mom, are we going to be okay? Like, with money and our house and everything? Sophie, I want you to listen to me very carefully, I said, taking her hands in mine. Your mom is much stronger and smarter than people give her credit for. We are not just going to be okay, we're going to be better than okay. Sometimes when bad things happen, they create opportunities for amazing things to happen instead. That night, after Sophie was asleep, I sat at my laptop and began drafting a business plan for the acquisition and transformation of Premier Boutique. The plan that emerged over the next several hours was ambitious and comprehensive, calling for not just the purchase of a single store, but the development of a small retail empire focused on empowering women through fashion and personal transformation. As dawn broke over Riverside, I realized that David's betrayal had actually set me free in ways I was only beginning to understand. The woman who had been content to support someone else's dreams was gone forever, replaced by someone ready to build her own empire from the ashes of a marriage that should have ended years earlier. David thought he had destroyed my life to make room for his new one with Jessica. Instead, he had simply cleared the way for me to become the woman I was always meant to be. The game was far from over, and the final score would be nothing like what he had calculated. 6 months later, I stood in the executive office of what was now Mitchell Enterprises, overlooking the very mall where my transformation had begun. The Premier Boutique below had been completely renovated and rebranded as Phoenix Rising, the flagship store of my rapidly expanding retail empire. The irony wasn't lost on me that I could literally look down on the exact spot where David had orchestrated my humiliation, now transformed into the foundation of my success. The morning began with a call from Lisa Park, my business mentor, and the venture capitalist who had initially funded my boutique acquisition. Sarah, the quarterly, numbers are extraordinary. Phoenix Rising isn't just profitable, it's become a destination. We're getting calls from investors who want to fund your expansion into other markets. The success had exceeded even my most optimistic projections. What had started as a strategic revenge purchase had evolved into a legitimate business empire, built on the simple premise that women deserved beautiful, high-quality clothing that made them feel powerful rather than diminished. The transformation of Premier Boutique had served as a blueprint for acquiring and renovating struggling retail spaces throughout California, each one emerging as a Phoenix Rising location that celebrated female empowerment and personal transformation. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma, who had become my unofficial intelligence coordinator during the months of David's downfall. Court hearing is at 2 p.m. David's lawyer filed another motion to delay, but Michael says the judge is losing. Patience. Also, saw Jessica at Starbucks this morning. She looks terrible. The legal proceedings had unfolded exactly as Michael Foster had predicted. David's fraud charges had triggered a cascade of professional and personal consequences that had systematically dismantled everything he had worked to build. The criminal investigation had led to his immediate suspension from the Financial Advisory Board, followed by the revocation of his licenses and certifications. Tom Bradley had been forced to buy out David's partnership stake at a fraction of its previous value to protect the firm's reputation. Most satisfying of all, Jessica had discovered that being the other woman in a scandal-ridden relationship was far less glamorous than she had anticipated. The venture capitalist she had targeted after David's collapse had quickly distanced himself when her connection to the fraud case became public knowledge. Her carefully constructed image as a successful business professional had crumbled along with David's, leaving her unemployed and essentially unemployable in the tight-knit Riverside business community. I arrived at the courthouse wearing a custom-tailored navy suit from my own boutique, the kind of power outfit that projected confidence and success rather than victimhood. David was already there with his third attorney in 6 months, looking haggard and desperate in a way that would have broken my heart a year earlier. Now I felt only the cool satisfaction of justice perfectly executed. The hearing itself was brief and decisive. Judge Morrison had clearly lost patience with David's attempts to delay the inevitable, and his tone was sharp as he addressed the final settlement terms. Mr. Mitchell, your pattern of financial fraud and willful concealment of assets has been thoroughly documented. The court finds that your actions constitute not only criminal behavior, but a deliberate attempt to defraud your spouse and child of their rightful financial security. David's lawyer made one final attempt to negotiate reduced penalties, but Judge Morrison was unmoved. The defendant will serve 18 months in minimum security prison, followed by 2 years of supervised probation. Restitution to Mrs. Mitchell will include full financial compensation plus punitive damages totaling $3 million. Custody of the minor child will remain with Mrs. Mitchell, with supervised visitation rights for the defendant upon completion of his incarceration. As the gavel fell, I felt a profound sense of closure that went beyond simple victory. David had gambled everything on his ability to manipulate and control me, and that gamble had cost him his freedom, his fortune, his career, and his relationship with Sophie. The man who had thought he was so clever in his financial manipulations was now facing bankruptcy and imprisonment, while I had built an empire from the ashes of his betrayal. Outside the courthouse, David approached me for what would be our final conversation as husband and wife. The confident, controlling man I had married was gone, replaced by someone broken and desperate who seemed unable to comprehend how completely his plans had backfired. "Sarah, please," he said, his voice hollow with defeat. "I know I made mistakes, but this is insane. You've destroyed my entire life over a relationship that was never even serious. Jessica meant nothing compared to what we had." The casual dismissal of Jessica as meaningless was perhaps the most revealing thing David had said throughout this entire ordeal. Even facing the complete destruction of his life, he still couldn't acknowledge that his betrayal had been a choice rather than an accident, that his systematic fraud had been deliberate rather than impulsive. "David," I replied calmly, "you didn't lose your life over a relationship. You lost it because you chose to commit fraud, betrayal, and emotional abuse rather than simply asking for a divorce if you were unhappy. Every consequence you're facing is the direct result of choices you made, not punishments I inflicted." His expression shifted to anger, the familiar flash of rage I had learned to recognize during our marriage whenever he was confronted with accountability for his actions. "You planned all of this from the beginning, didn't you? The business, the investigations, turning everyone against me. This was never about justice. It was about revenge." I considered his accusation for a moment, recognizing the grain of truth within his distorted perception. I had indeed planned and executed a comprehensive campaign against him, but not for the reasons he imagined. "David, what I planned was my own survival and success. Your downfall was simply the natural consequence of your actions catching up with you. If you had been honest about wanting to end our marriage, if you had treated me with basic respect, during the process, none of this would have been necessary. But you chose deception, fraud, and cruelty instead." Michael Foster appeared beside me, signaling that our conversation was over. "Mrs. Mitchell, we have a business meeting in 30 minutes. Mr. Mitchell, my client has fulfilled all her legal obligations regarding this divorce. Any future communication should go through my office." As we walked away, David called after me one final time. "Sarah, what about Sophie? Are you really going to keep her from seeing her father over your need for revenge?" I turned back to face him, feeling nothing but pity for the man who still couldn't understand that his relationship with Sophie was another casualty of his own choices. "David, Sophie will see you when and if she chooses to, once you've served your sentence and demonstrated that you're capable of being the father she deserves, but that decision will be hers to make, not mine to control. The business meeting Michael had referenced was real and significant. James Anderson, the venture capitalist who had become both an investor and a romantic interest over the past few months, was waiting in my office to discuss the next phase of Phoenix Rising's expansion. James represented everything David was not: ethical, supportive of my ambitions, and secure enough in his own success to celebrate mine rather than compete with it. "Sarah, the Los Angeles market analysis came back even better than we hoped," James said, spreading architectural plans across my conference table. "The Beverly Hills location could be operational within 6 months, and we already have investors interested in franchising opportunities throughout the Southwest." As we reviewed expansion plans and financial projections, I marveled at how completely my life had transformed. The woman who had been humiliated in a boutique less than a year earlier was now the CEO of a multi-million-dollar retail empire, with plans to expand nationally and eventually internationally. More importantly, I had become someone Sophie could be proud of. A mother who had faced adversity and emerged stronger rather than diminished. That evening, Sophie and I celebrated the conclusion of the legal proceedings with dinner at her favorite restaurant, followed by a visit to the original Phoenix Rising location. Sophie had become the unofficial mascot of the business. Her input on children's fashion, helping to shape our young clientele offerings. Watching her confidently interact with customers and staff, offering opinions on merchandise and store layout, I saw glimpses of the strong, independent woman she was becoming. "Mom, do you think Dad will ever understand why what he did was wrong?" she asked as we walked through the store she had helped design. The question demonstrated the emotional maturity Sophie had developed through our ordeal, her ability to separate her love for her father from her recognition of his harmful behavior. "I hope so, sweetheart. Sometimes it takes losing everything for people to understand what they should have valued. Your dad made choices that hurt people he should have protected, and now he has to live with the consequences." "Are you happy now?" she asked with the directness that had become her trademark. I considered the question seriously, looking around at the bustling store that had risen from the ashes of my humiliation. Customers browsed confidently through carefully curated selections, assisted by staff members who had been trained to empower rather than judge. The atmosphere was one of celebration and transformation, exactly what I had envisioned when I first conceived of Phoenix Rising. "Sophie, I'm more than happy. I'm proud of who we've become and excited about what we're building together. Your dad thought he was ending my story when he betrayed our family, but he actually just gave me the opportunity to write a much better one." 3 months later, I received an invitation that would have seemed impossible during my darkest moments. In that hotel lobby nearly a year earlier, the Riverside Chamber of Commerce wanted to honor me as their Entrepreneur of the Year, recognizing not just the financial success of Phoenix Rising, but its impact on the local community and economy. The ceremony would be held at the very country club where David and I had once entertained clients, where Jessica had tried to establish herself as his replacement wife. The evening of the awards ceremony, I chose to wear a dress from my own boutique, a stunning emerald creation that had been designed specifically for women who wanted to command attention rather than fade into the background. Emma accompanied me as my guest, and James served as my date, providing the perfect contrast to the isolated desperation I had felt during David's public betrayal. The ballroom was filled with Riverside's business and social elite, many of whom had witnessed various stages of my transformation, from David's abandoned wife to successful entrepreneur. Tom Bradley was there with his wife, beaming with pride at his role in my professional development. Carol Thompson, now the regional manager for Phoenix Rising's expansion, sat at our table wearing one of our signature power suits. When my name was called for the award, the standing ovation was genuine and sustained. These weren't people offering sympathy to a victim, but recognition to a peer who had earned their respect through achievement rather than circumstance. As I walked to the podium, I caught sight of Margaret Mitchell, David's mother, sitting in the back of the room with tears in her eyes. She had reached out months earlier to apologize for her son's behavior and to maintain a relationship with Sophie, demonstrating that not all of David's family shared his capacity for cruelty. My acceptance speech was brief but heartfelt, focusing on the theme of transformation through adversity, without specifically referencing the personal details that had inspired my journey. Sometimes life presents us with challenges that seem insurmountable, moments when everything we thought we knew about ourselves and our circumstances proves to be inadequate. Those moments can either destroy us or become the foundation for becoming someone stronger than we ever imagined possible. The applause that followed was energizing rather than merely polite, and I realized that my story had become something larger than personal revenge or individual success. Phoenix Rising had become a symbol of female empowerment and resilience that resonated with women throughout the community who had faced their own challenges and setbacks. After the ceremony, as James and I drove through downtown Riverside past the illuminated sign for Mitchell and Bradley Financial, I reflected on the complete reversal of fortune that had occurred in less than 12 months. David was beginning his prison sentence while I was being celebrated as the community's most successful entrepreneur. Jessica was working as a receptionist at a small accounting firm while I was planning international expansion. The man who had thought he was so clever in his manipulations was facing bankruptcy, while I had built wealth that would secure Sophie's future for generations. The final chapter of my transformation came 6 months later when I received a letter from David's prison counselor requesting permission for him to contact Sophie as part of his rehabilitation program. The letter included a therapeutic assessment suggesting that David was finally beginning to understand the scope of harm his actions had caused and was working toward genuine accountability rather than self-pity. I discussed the request with Sophie, now 9 years old and remarkably wise about the complexities of adult relationships and consequences. Her response demonstrated the strength and clarity that had sustained us both through our ordeal. "Mom, I think I want to talk to Dad eventually, but not because I'm ready to forgive him or because I miss the way things used to be. I want to see if he's really learning to be better, because someday he might be ready to be the kind of father I deserve." As I write this final entry in what began as a journal of survival and became a record of triumph, Phoenix Rising has expanded to 12 locations across 3 states, with plans for national franchising already in development. Sophie and I live in a beautiful penthouse apartment overlooking the city, with views that include the mall where my transformation began and the financial district where David once worked. The boutique where I was humiliated has become the flagship, store of an empire built on the principle that every woman deserves to feel powerful and beautiful. The credit cards that were declined in that moment of public embarrassment have been replaced by business accounts that fund dreams rather than dependencies. The husband who thought he could discard me for a newer model is serving time for fraud, while I plan my wedding to a man who celebrates my strength rather than fearing it. David's betrayal, which was designed to break me, instead broke open a life that had become too small for who I was meant to be. His calculated cruelty gave me the motivation to discover capabilities I didn't know I possessed, and to build something far more magnificent than the diminished existence he had planned. For me, the woman who walked out of Premier Boutique that day, humiliated and abandoned, was indeed destroyed in that moment. But from her ashes rose someone infinitely more powerful, someone who understood that the best revenge isn't destruction of your enemies, but construction of a life so successful and fulfilling that their betrayal becomes the greatest gift they could have given you. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you really does turn out to be the best thing that ever happened to you. You just have to be strong enough to transform the ending into a beginning. 2 years had passed since my world had shattered in that boutique, and now I stood before the mirror in my Beverly Hills flagship store, adjusting the emerald necklace that had become my signature piece. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the desperate housewife who had once begged David for explanations about declined credit cards. This woman commanded rooms, built empires, and had just been featured on the cover of Forbes as one of America's most innovative retail entrepreneurs. The morning began with a call that would have seemed impossible during those dark early days of my transformation. Anna Chen, the editor of Vogue Business, was on the line discussing a documentary they wanted to produce about Phoenix Rising's impact on women's retail and empowerment. The irony that she shared a surname with Jessica wasn't lost on me, but that connection to my past felt as distant as a half-remembered dream. "Sarah, your story represents something unprecedented in retail," Anna explained with genuine enthusiasm. "You've created more than a business. You've built a movement that's changing how women think about fashion, power, and personal transformation. We want to capture that evolution from the very beginning." The documentary would require me to revisit the painful origins of Phoenix Rising, to speak publicly about the humiliation and betrayal that had catalyzed my journey. For months, I had declined similar requests, preferring to focus on the future rather than dwelling on the past. But something about Anna's approach felt different, more substantive than mere sensationalism. "I'm interested," I told her, "but with conditions. This story needs to be about empowerment and transformation, not just personal revenge or drama. The women who shop in my stores and follow my brand deserve better than tabloid entertainment." Anna agreed immediately, understanding that the real story lay not in the details of David's betrayal, but in the systematic way I had rebuilt my life into something far more powerful than what had been destroyed. We scheduled the initial interviews for the following month, giving me time to prepare for what would be the most comprehensive public discussion of my journey to date. That afternoon brought another milestone that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier. Sophie walked into my office after school, now 10 years old and radiating the confidence that came from watching her mother transform adversity into triumph. She had grown into a remarkable child, wise beyond her years, but still maintaining the joy and optimism that I had feared David's betrayal might destroy. "Mom, I got the letter from Dad today," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the directness that had become her trademark. "He wants to know if we can visit when he gets out next month." David's release from prison had been approaching for weeks, and I had been dreading the complications it might bring to the peaceful life Sophie and I had built. His letters over the past 18 months had evolved from angry blame to desperate pleas to what seemed like genuine remorse, but I remained skeptical about his capacity for real change. "What do you want to do, sweetheart?" I asked, knowing that Sophie's feelings about her father were far more complex than simple love or hatred. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her words carefully. "I think I want to see him, but not because I forgive him or because I miss him the way I used to. I want to see if he's really different, if he understands what he did to us. And I want him to see who we became after he left." Her wisdom never ceased to amaze me. At 10 years old, Sophie understood concepts of accountability and personal growth that many adults struggled with. She had learned to separate her biological connection to David from any obligation to accept harmful behavior, a lesson that had taken me decades to master. "We'll arrange a meeting in a neutral location," I decided. "Somewhere public where you feel safe and can leave if you become uncomfortable. And Sophie, remember that whatever your father has or hasn't learned about himself, it doesn't change the fact that you are loved, valued, and secure in our life together." That evening, James and I discussed the upcoming challenges over dinner at our favorite restaurant overlooking the city. Our relationship had evolved gradually from business partnership to romantic involvement to something approaching the kind of marriage I had always imagined was possible but had never experienced with David. James celebrated my successes rather than competing with them, supported my ambitions rather than limiting them, and treated Sophie as a cherished daughter rather than an inconvenient obligation. "Are you worried about David's release affecting your peace of mind?" James asked, understanding the complexities of my situation without needing extensive explanation. "Not worried exactly," I replied, considering the question carefully. "But aware that this represents a test of how completely I've moved beyond the woman I was when he knew me. He's going to expect to find some remnant of the wife he controlled and manipulated. Instead, he's going to encounter someone he's never met." James smiled with the quiet confidence that had drawn me to him initially. "Sarah, you've built an empire from nothing, raised an incredible daughter through impossible circumstances, and become a role model for women across the country. David's opinion of who you are or who you've become is completely irrelevant to your reality." The truth of his words settled into my consciousness with the weight of absolute certainty. David's approval or disapproval, his surprise or resentment, at my transformation, his attempts to reclaim any influence over my decisions, were all equally meaningless in the context of the life I had created. He had forfeited any right to opinion about my choices when he decided to commit fraud and betrayal rather than simply requesting a divorce. 3 weeks later, I received a call that provided perfect symmetry to my journey of transformation. Carol Thompson, now my regional operations director, was calling with news about the original Premier Boutique location where my humiliation had occurred. "Sarah, you're not going to believe this," Carol said with barely contained excitement. "The mall management just offered us the opportunity to expand into the entire wing where Premier Boutique was located. They want to create a Phoenix Rising destination experience with multiple departments and services all under our brand." The proposal was ambitious and expensive, requiring a significant investment to transform what had once been a single boutique into a comprehensive retail experience. But the symbolism was irresistible. The location where I had been denied the ability to purchase a simple dress for my daughter would become the flagship destination for women seeking transformation and empowerment. "Draw up the expansion plans," I told Carol. "I want this to be our most spectacular location, a place where women come not just to shop, but to celebrate their own journeys of growth and change." The expansion project consumed the following months, requiring careful coordination between architects, designers, and construction crews to create something unprecedented in retail. The new Phoenix Rising destination would include not just clothing and accessories, but also personal styling services, professional development workshops, and even childcare facilities for mothers who needed support while investing in themselves. During this period, David was released from prison and began the slow process of rebuilding his life from the foundation of court-ordered community service and supervised probation. His first request for contact came through his probation officer, a formal request to meet with Sophie in a controlled environment as part of his rehabilitation requirements. The meeting took place at a family counseling center, with a therapist present to facilitate communication and ensure Sophie's emotional safety. I waited in the adjacent room, available if needed, but respecting Sophie's autonomy in navigating her relationship with her father. When they emerged an hour later, Sophie's expression was thoughtful rather than upset, suggesting the encounter had been difficult but not traumatic. David looked older than his years, diminished by incarceration, and the complete loss of everything that had once defined his identity. His expensive suits had been replaced by simple, inexpensive clothing, and his confident bearing had been replaced by the uncertain posture of someone learning to navigate the world without power or influence. "How did it go?" I asked Sophie, as we drove home, giving her space to process the experience without pressure to provide immediate reactions. "He's different," she said finally. "Sadder, I think, and maybe more honest than he used to be. He apologized for what he did to us, and it seemed real this time, not like he was just trying to get something from me." "And how do you feel about that?" I asked, understanding that Sophie's emotional response was more important than David's performance of remorse. Sophie considered the question with the same careful thought she brought to all complex issues. I'm glad he's sorry, because it means he finally understands that what he did was wrong. But I don't think sorry fixes everything that got broken. Some things can't be put back the way they were. Her insight was profound and mature, recognizing that accountability was necessary but not sufficient for repair of deep damage. David's apology might represent genuine growth on his part, but it didn't create any obligation for Sophie or me to restore him to a position of influence in our lives. The grand reopening of the Phoenix Rising flagship destination took place on a Saturday morning exactly 2 years and 3 months after my original humiliation in that space. The transformation was spectacular, with the former boutique expanded into a multi-level experience that celebrated every aspect of women's empowerment and personal growth. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was attended by local dignitaries, business leaders, and hundreds of customers who had followed my journey from the beginning. As I stood before the crowd with oversized scissors in hand, I caught sight of a familiar figure in the back of the gathering. David stood at the edge of the crowd, wearing simple civilian clothes and maintaining a respectful distance from the celebration. Our eyes met for a moment across the assembled crowd, and I saw in his expression something I had never encountered during our marriage: genuine respect, mixed with what appeared to be awe. He was seeing me clearly for perhaps the first time, not as an extension of his own ambitions, but as an independent force who had built something remarkable from the wreckage of their shared past. After the ribbon cutting and initial tour of the new facility, David approached me with the hesitant manner of someone unsure of their welcome. The man who had once commanded every room he entered now moved with the careful deference of someone who understood they were operating entirely at another person's discretion. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I wanted to congratulate you on everything you've built. This is incredible, and Sophie speaks about you with such pride. I know my words don't mean much after everything that happened, but I want you to know that I understand now what I destroyed when I made those choices." His acknowledgement was more complete than I had expected, lacking the self-serving justifications and blame-shifting that had characterized his previous attempts at apology. For the first time since our marriage ended, David seemed to be taking full responsibility for his actions without expecting anything in return. "Thank you for saying that," I replied, meaning it sincerely while maintaining appropriate boundaries. "I hope your understanding helps you make better choices going forward, especially in your relationship with Sophie." David nodded, accepting the implicit limits in my response without protest. "I know I have a lot to prove before anyone trusts me again, especially Sophie. I'm not asking for forgiveness or trying to restore what I broke. I just wanted you to know that I see what you've accomplished, and I'm amazed by the woman you've become." As he walked away, disappearing back into the crowd of celebration, I felt a profound sense of completion. David's acknowledgement wasn't necessary for my sense of achievement or self-worth, but it represented the final closing of a chapter that had begun with such pain and humiliation. The woman he had tried to destroy had not only survived, but had flourished beyond anything he could have imagined. The documentary filming began the following month, with Anna Chen's team capturing both the current success of Phoenix Rising and the historical context of its origins. The process of revisiting my journey from victim to entrepreneur was surprisingly therapeutic, allowing me to see my own growth with the clarity that comes from temporal distance. What would you say to women who are facing similar betrayals or setbacks? Anna asked during one of our final interview sessions. I considered the question carefully, thinking about all the messages I had received from women who had found inspiration in my story. I would tell them that the worst moment of your life might actually be the moment you finally get permission to become who you were always meant to be. Sometimes we stay in situations that diminish us because they're familiar, or because we're afraid of the unknown. When those situations are taken away from us, even through betrayal or loss, we discover capabilities we never knew we had. The documentary, titled Rising from Ashes: The Phoenix Story, premiered 6 months later at the Sundance Film Festival before airing on major networks and streaming platforms. The response was overwhelming, with women across the country sharing their own stories of transformation and empowerment inspired by my journey. More importantly, the documentary led to opportunities I had never imagined. Publishers offered book deals, universities invited me to speak about entrepreneurship and resilience, and other business leaders sought my advice on building companies with social impact. Phoenix Rising evolved from a retail brand into a platform for promoting women's empowerment across multiple industries and sectors. On Sophie's 11th birthday, we celebrated in the private dining room above the flagship Phoenix Rising location, surrounded by the family we had chosen rather than the one we had been born into. Emma was there with her husband and children. James had become a permanent fixture in our lives, and even Margaret Mitchell, David's mother, had maintained her relationship with Sophie despite her son's disgrace. As Sophie blew out the candles on her birthday cake, I reflected on how completely our lives had transformed since that devastating Saturday at the mall. The woman who had been denied the ability to buy her daughter a birthday dress had built an empire that now employed hundreds of people and served thousands of customers seeking their own transformations. "Mom," Sophie said later that evening as I tucked her into bed, "do you ever think about what would have happened if Dad hadn't done what he did? Like, if our family had stayed together?" The question demonstrated Sophie's continued processing of her complex family history, her need to understand the alternative paths that might have existed. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but I think we would have stayed smaller than we were meant to be. Dad's choices were wrong and hurtful, but they also freed us to become who we really are instead of who we thought we were supposed to be." Sophie nodded, thoughtfully. "I'm glad we became who we are now, even though it was hard getting here." Her words captured the essence of our entire journey. The path from humiliation to empowerment had been difficult and sometimes painful, but it had led us to a life more authentic and fulfilling than anything we had lost. David's betrayal, intended to break us, had instead broken us open to possibilities we had never imagined. As I write these final words, Phoenix Rising has expanded to 47 locations across 12 states, with international franchising agreements in development. Sophie is thriving academically and socially, confident in her own worth and capable of creating healthy relationships based on mutual respect rather than dependence. James and I are planning our wedding for next spring, a celebration of love between equals rather than a merger of dependencies. David has rebuilt a modest life focused on making amends for his past actions. He works as a financial counselor for people recovering from bankruptcy and addiction, using his experience with consequences to help others avoid similar mistakes. His relationship with Sophie is slowly improving, based on respect for her autonomy rather than expectations of forgiveness. The boutique where my world once collapsed is now the centerpiece of an empire built on the principle that every woman deserves to feel powerful, beautiful, and capable of creating her own destiny. The credit cards that were declined in that moment of public humiliation have been replaced by business accounts that fund dreams and ambitions across the country. Most importantly, the woman who walked out of that store in tears, abandoned and humiliated, discovered that she had never actually needed rescuing. She had only needed permission to rescue herself, to become the hero of her own story rather than a supporting character in someone else's narrative. Sometimes the worst betrayal is also the greatest liberation. Sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted creates space for everything you never knew you needed. Sometimes the end of your old life is actually the beginning of your real life. The phoenix doesn't rise despite the fire that destroys it. The phoenix rises because of the fire, transformed by the flames into something far more magnificent than what came before. 5 years after that devastating Saturday at Westfield Shopping Center, I stood on the stage of the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., preparing to deliver the keynote address at the National Women's Business Summit. The audience of 3,000 entrepreneurs executives, and innovators represented the culmination of a journey that had begun with declined credit cards and public humiliation, but had evolved into something far greater than personal vindication. The morning had started with a phone call from the White House Chief of Staff, inviting me to serve on the Presidential Advisory Council for Women's Economic Empowerment. The invitation represented not just recognition of Phoenix Rising's business success, but acknowledgement of the social movement we had inadvertently created. What had started as one woman's response to betrayal had become a national conversation about female resilience, economic independence, and the power of transformation. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, looking out at the sea of faces that included some of the most powerful women in America. 5 years ago, I thought I knew exactly who I was. I was someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's supporting player, in a life that I believed was stable and secure. I had no idea that identity was about to be completely destroyed, or that from its destruction would emerge someone I had never had the courage to become. The speech I delivered that day would later be viewed millions of times online, quoted in business schools, and referenced in countless articles about overcoming adversity. But in that moment, standing before an audience that included senators, CEOs, and Supreme Court justices, I was simply sharing the truth about what happens when you refuse to let other people's choices define your limitations. I spoke about the mall incident without dwelling on the personal details, focusing instead on the universal experience of having your assumptions about life suddenly shattered. The moment when everything you thought you could count on disappears is terrifying, I told the audience. But it's also liberating because it forces you to discover what you're actually capable of when you stop trying to be what other people expect and start being who you really are. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 10 minutes. But more meaningful than the applause were the conversations that happened afterward. Women approached me throughout the evening to share their own stories of transformation, of businesses built from divorce settlements, of careers launched after betrayals, of dreams pursued after decades of being told they were impractical. Dr. Michelle Williams, the renowned psychologist who had written extensively about post-traumatic growth, found me during the reception. "Sarah, what you've accomplished goes far beyond business success. You've created a template for transforming victimization into empowerment that's helping women across the country rewrite their own narratives." Her observation resonated deeply because it captured something I had been sensing but hadn't fully articulated. Phoenix Rising had become more than a retail brand. It had become a symbol of possibility for women who had been written off, written down, or written out of their own stories by other people's expectations and limitations. The flight back to Los Angeles gave me time to reflect on how completely my life had transformed since that day in the boutique. Sophie, now 12 years old, was spending the weekend with James at our Malibu beach house, working on a science project that combined her interests in marine biology and environmental conservation. She had grown into a confident, curious young woman who approached challenges with the same strategic thinking that had carried me through my own transformation. James had proposed 6 months earlier during a quiet dinner at home, presenting me with a ring he had designed himself rather than assuming he knew what I would want. Our relationship had evolved into the kind of partnership I had always imagined, was possible but had never experienced. He supported my ambitions without trying to direct them, celebrated my successes without competing with them, and treated Sophie as his own daughter without trying to replace her relationship with David. David's evolution had been perhaps the most surprising aspect of the entire journey. His release from prison had been followed by a gradual but genuine transformation into someone capable of accountability and growth. He now ran a nonprofit organization, helping formerly incarcerated individuals rebuild their financial lives, using his own experience with consequences to guide others away from similar mistakes. His relationship with Sophie had stabilized into something healthy and appropriate, based on respect for her autonomy rather than expectations of forgiveness. Most remarkably, David had become one of Phoenix Rising's most effective advocates, not through any formal partnership, but through his willingness to speak honestly about the harm caused by financial abuse and manipulation. His presentations to men's groups about the real cost of betraying family trust had become legendary in rehabilitation circles, providing a perspective on accountability that few other speakers could offer. The documentary about Phoenix Rising's origins had won 3 Emmy Awards and had been translated into 17 languages, inspiring women's empowerment movements in countries across 6 continents. The book I had written about transforming adversity into opportunity had spent 43 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and had been adopted as required reading in business schools from Harvard to Stanford. But beyond the public, recognition and business success, the most meaningful transformation had been internal. The woman who had once shaped her entire identity around supporting someone else's ambitions had discovered capabilities and passions she had never imagined possessing. The strategic thinking that had carried me through the darkest period of my life had evolved into a comprehensive approach to building businesses and movements that created value for everyone involved. My phone buzzed with a text from Emma, who had become Phoenix Rising's chief marketing officer after completing her MBA while working part-time for the company. Sarah, the Phoenix Foundation scholarship recipients have been selected. 47 women getting full funding for business school this year, including 3 survivors of domestic financial abuse. Thought you'd want to know before the public announcement. The Phoenix Foundation had been established 3 years earlier to provide educational and entrepreneurial opportunities for women recovering from financial abuse, domestic violence, and other forms of systematic disempowerment. The foundation represented the natural evolution of Phoenix Rising's mission, extending beyond retail into direct intervention for women facing circumstances similar to what I had experienced. Each scholarship recipient received not just financial support for education, but also mentorship, networking opportunities, and access to the business development resources that had been crucial to my own success. The program had already produced 24 successful entrepreneurs, including several who had gone on to start their own foundations supporting other women's advancement. That evening, I stood on the balcony of my Beverly Hills penthouse, looking out over the city lights that included the illuminated signs of Phoenix Rising locations scattered throughout the metropolitan area. The view encompassed not just the geographical spread of my business empire, but the symbolic representation of how far I had traveled from that devastated woman in the mall. Sophie joined me on the balcony, now tall enough to rest her chin on my shoulder as we watched the city sparkle below us. Mom, do you ever think about what advice you would give to the woman you were before everything changed? Her question was typical of the profound inquiries that had become Sophie's trademark, the kind of philosophical exploration that demonstrated her emotional intelligence and analytical thinking. I considered her question carefully, thinking about the woman I had been before David's betrayal had forced me to discover who I really was. I think I would tell her that she was already everything she needed to be, I said finally. She just didn't know it yet, because she was so focused on being what other people expected that she never explored what she was actually capable of. Sometimes we need our comfortable assumptions to be destroyed before we can discover our uncomfortable truths. Sophie nodded thoughtfully. Do you think Dad did you a favor by leaving even though he hurt you? The complexity of her question reflected the sophisticated understanding she had developed about the paradoxical nature of our family's transformation. David's betrayal had been genuinely harmful and destructive, but it had also created the conditions for growth and achievement that might never have occurred otherwise. I think your father did me a favor accidentally, I replied. He was trying to hurt me and get what he wanted for himself. But by destroying the life I thought I wanted, he forced me to build the life I actually needed. The favor wasn't intentional, but the result was the same. The following morning brought news that would have seemed impossible during those early days of rebuilding. The board of directors of Westfield Shopping Center, the mall where my transformation had begun, was offering to rename the entire complex Phoenix Rising Center, in recognition of my business success and community impact. The proposal included plans for a museum of women's entrepreneurship and a permanent exhibition about overcoming adversity through business innovation. The symbolic significance of the offer was overwhelming. The location where I had experienced my most humiliating defeat would become a permanent monument to the victory that had emerged from that defeat. The mall where I had been denied the ability to purchase a simple dress for my daughter would carry my name and celebrate the empire I had built from that moment of rejection. I accepted the renaming proposal with the condition that the museum include not just my story, but the stories of hundreds of other women who had transformed adversity into achievement. The exhibition would feature interactive displays allowing visitors to explore their own potential for growth and change, turning the museum into a catalyst for transformation rather than simply a celebration of past success. The groundbreaking ceremony for the museum took place on a Saturday morning exactly 5 years after my original humiliation in the boutique. The crowd included local dignitaries, business leaders, and hundreds of Phoenix Rising customers who had followed my journey from the beginning, but the most meaningful presence was that of the women whose stories would be featured in the museum. Entrepreneurs who had built businesses from divorce settlements, survivors who had created empires from restraining orders, mothers who had transformed custody battles into career launches. As I stood before the crowd with the ceremonial golden shovel in my hands, I caught sight of a familiar figure in the audience. Carol Thompson, who had witnessed my humiliation as a store manager and had become my regional operations director as I built my empire, was wiping tears from her eyes as she watched the ceremony unfold. After the speeches and photo opportunities, Carol approached me with an expression of wonder that I had seen many times over the years from people who had witnessed my complete transformation. "Sarah, do you remember what you said to me that day when you came back to the store to talk about business opportunities?" I smiled, remembering the conversation that had marked one of my first steps toward reclaiming power from the situation that had seemed to destroy me. I said I was exploring retail opportunities because I believed women deserved beautiful clothing that made them feel powerful rather than diminished. Carol nodded, her eyes bright with tears of joy rather than sorrow. "You've done so much more than that. You've created a world where women believe they deserve to feel powerful in every aspect of their lives. You've changed how thousands of women think about their own potential." The truth of her observation settled into my consciousness with the weight of genuine accomplishment. Phoenix Rising had indeed become more than a business. It had become a movement that challenged women to expand their own definitions of what was possible. The retail locations served as physical symbols of transformation, but the real impact was in the mindset shifts that occurred when women realized they had permission to want more from their lives. That evening, James and I hosted a private dinner for the museum's featured entrepreneurs, women whose stories would inspire future visitors to pursue their own transformations. The conversation around our dining table was electric with the energy of women who had refused to accept limitations imposed by circumstances or other people's expectations. Dr. Angela Martinez, who had built a medical technology company after her divorce, raised her glass in a toast that captured the essence of what we had all achieved. To the moments that break us open and force us to discover who we really are. May we never again settle for being smaller than our actual size. The toast was echoed around the table by women who had built empires from eviction notices, launched careers from bankruptcy proceedings, and created foundations from restraining orders. Each story was unique in its details, but unified in its theme. The refusal to let other people's actions define the boundaries of what was possible. As our guests departed and James helped Sophie with her weekend homework, I found myself alone in my home office, surrounded by the awards, photographs, and mementos that documented my journey from victim to victor. The walls displayed magazine covers featuring my story, photographs from the White House visit, and framed letters from women whose lives had been changed by Phoenix Rising's message of empowerment. But the most meaningful item in the room was A simple photograph taken by a security camera at Westfield Shopping Center on that Saturday 5 years earlier. It showed me walking out of Premier Boutique with Sophie's hand in mine, both of us clearly devastated by what had just occurred. I had framed the photograph not as a reminder of pain, but as documentation of the moment when my real life had actually begun. The woman in that photograph had thought her world was ending. She had no idea that she was actually walking toward the beginning of everything she was meant to become. She couldn't see that the humiliation she was experiencing would become the foundation of an empire, that the betrayal that seemed to destroy her would actually liberate her to discover capabilities she had never imagined possessing. My laptop chimed with an email from Anna Chen, the documentary filmmaker who had captured Phoenix Rising's story for national audiences. She was writing to inform me that the film had been selected for preservation in the National Archives as a significant document of women's empowerment in the early 21st century. The email included a quote from the selection committee. This documentary captures not just one woman's triumph over adversity, but a blueprint for transformation that has inspired a generation of female entrepreneurs. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the impossible distance I had traveled from that Saturday at the mall. The woman who had been denied the ability to buy her daughter a birthday dress had built a retail empire that now employed over 3,000 people across 14 states. The wife who had been abandoned through calculated humiliation had become a nationally recognized advocate for women's economic empowerment. The mother who had feared for her daughter's future security had created generational wealth that would support Sophie's children and grandchildren. But beyond the measurable successes and public recognition, the most profound transformation had been internal. I had discovered that I was capable of strategic thinking, creative problem-solving, and inspirational leadership that I had never been allowed to explore during my marriage. The woman who had defined herself entirely through relationships with others had learned to value her own judgment, trust her own instincts, and create her own definitions of success. The final entry in my journal that night captured the essence of everything I had learned through 5 years of transformation. The person who betrays you isn't necessarily doing you a favor, but they are definitely giving you an opportunity. What you do with that opportunity determines whether their betrayal becomes your destruction or your liberation. Choose liberation. Choose to become who you were meant to be before other people's expectations convinced you to be smaller. Choose to build something magnificent from the wreckage of what you thought you wanted. Sophie appeared in my doorway as I was closing the journal, wearing pajamas and the confident smile that had become her trademark. "Mom, I just wanted to say goodnight, and thank you for showing me that women can build their own empires instead of waiting for someone else to give them permission to succeed." Her words represented the ultimate victory of my transformation. Sophie had grown up watching her mother rebuild a life from nothing, demonstrating through daily example that women possess the capability to create their own security, define their own success, and build their own legacies. She would never accept limitations imposed by other people's expectations because she had witnessed firsthand what was possible when those limitations were rejected. As I tucked Sophie into bed and turned off the lights in our beautiful home, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you have fulfilled your purpose. The boutique where I had been humiliated now carried my name and celebrated my achievements. The man who had betrayed me had learned to respect the woman I had become. The daughter who had witnessed my destruction had grown up watching my resurrection. The phoenix doesn't rise in spite of the fire that consumes it. The phoenix rises because the fire burns away everything that was false, everything that was limiting, everything that was smaller than its true nature. What emerges from those flames isn't a restoration of what was lost, but a revelation of what was always possible. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is actually the best thing that ever happened to you. You just have to be brave enough to build something magnificent from the ashes of what you thought you wanted. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.